Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
NATO alijansa slavi svoj 75. rođendan u trenutku velikih napetosti kako u Europi, tako i u Aziji. Detaljnije o tome pojašnjava nam Sten Rynning, autor i profesor ratnih studija na Univerzitetu u Južnoj Danskoj. Professor, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera channel, and thank you so much for taking time to speak to us. Now, first of all, what prompted you to write a book on the history of NATO and for it to coincide with the 75th anniversary of the alliance?
Well, first of all, 75 years for a political military alliance of this nature is significant. And I felt that it was worthwhile offering my thoughts on what is going on, why is NATO still around. And then there's also an additional reason that NATO has twice bitten off more than it could chew. And then it's been too ambitious, it's gotten into a crisis. And I think NATO today is in a real crisis, and it needs to think about how to control its appetite. And I integrate this perspective in the book, of course.
Right. When you say NATO is in a real crisis, what exactly do you mean?
I mean that there's a shifting the balance of influence and decision-making from the Americas to Europe. And we see this in the context of the war in Ukraine, that Congress is hesitating. Europeans must deliver more firepower to the Ukrainians. And this shifting balance is offsetting a lot of political concerns. And those concerns are real, and they could ultimately lead key decision makers to question the credibility of NATO. We know, of course, that Donald Trump in the United States is one of them, but he's not the only one. And if this becomes more widespread, that is a real crisis for NATO.
Right, but haven't we been told that Russia's invasion of Ukraine only reinvigorated the alliance, gave it a new meaning?
It did. It did for a while. Shortly after the invasion in February of 2022, NATO wrote its new strategic concept, which is sort of a compass for where the alliance is going. And that was facilitated and reinforced by the common opposition to Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Okay.
But the war now goes on, and it has become painful for everyone involved. It is costly, and it requires some courageous decisions in every country. And it's not clear whether the allies would like Russia to lose or whether they would like Ukraine to win. And that actually matters a lot. And that is just proving very hard to navigate for the allies.
Right. Well, this is really interesting what you're saying. We'll get back to that in a while, but let's first go back to your book. And let me ask you a very blunt question. So would you say that NATO is the greatest military and the longest lasting military alliance in world history?
Well, history that's a big subject matter. But I would say in modern times, since the emergence of the modern state, so for the last, give or take, 400 or 500 years, it is certainly the longest existing and most important multilateral, that is many nations, formal alliance that is based on a treaty that has had a tremendous impact on political order. So in that sense, modern times, yes, absolutely the most important alliance.
Right, but in what ways has NATO demonstrated, adaptability throughout its history to navigate the complex geopolitical landscape and maintain its status as a preeminent military alliance?
So NATO has done this by working its two key instruments. One is its military forces and how it develops a defense posture. The other is its political level or its diplomatic tools. And we see through history that NATO has tended to emphasize sometimes the defense tool. Then it was an alliance of deterrence. Then later it's rebalanced that and developed its diplomatic tool, and then it became an alliance of defense and dialogue. Then after the Cold War, it became an alliance of partnership emphasizing a lot more the diplomatic tool, weakening the military tool. And now with Russia's war on Ukraine, it is rapidly trying to increase the military instrument in its toolbox and refashioning, thinking about what do we do with this diplomatic tool that didn't work. So adjusting diplomacy and defense has always been NATO's recipe for adaptability.
Right, but how have strategic imperatives of NATO evolved over time, and how have they reflected shifts in global power dynamics?
Well, NATO has always sought to adjust to the reality of the Euro-Atlantic space. So when the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact was there to oppose it, NATO had to be strong to keep them out. But then they went away, and Russia took over from the Soviet Union, and for a while, Russia was a partner with NATO. Then NATO adapted to look at how do we cope with crisis and the management of crisis outside of the Euro-Atlantic area. Ultimately, it led NATO to Afghanistan. It didn't turn out well. And today, NATO is back to the Euro-Atlantic area, but very importantly, it's not just about Russia, it's also very much about China. How China as a global power has become present and is playing a role inside Europe.
Right. But, at one time, as I said, after the end of the Cold War, there were individuals who considered NATO as an obsolete alliance, which was no longer necessary. We heard about Francis Fukuyama and, the end of history, the liberal Western world already had won over communism. So at one time, as you say, NATO had lost its orientation, right? So he tried to deal a little bit with Afghanistan, with piracy, with countering terrorism. And now, is it regaining its strategic orientation?
Yes, I guess in a way you can say that is the case, that Russia has given NATO a new strategic orientation. But going back to the early end of the Cold War and the early post-Cold War period, there was a debate between those on the one hand who thought we need new tools for a new Europe. The old tools, the Warsaw Pact, NATO, we will let them recede into history. We'll build something new. But others were thinking, and they ultimately, of course, won the day, they thought NATO has guaranteed stability in Europe for 40 years. We shouldn't let this experience go away. We should build on it. And their wager, and this is what happened, was to say that if we transform NATO from something that is heavily military to fight the Cold War, to prevent the hot war and the Cold War, and make it more political, enlarge it, make it more diplomatic, then Europe can stabilize, and we will even partner with Russia. And that became the answer. And when NATO went global to do crisis management, in the eyes of many people, Europe was a done deal. Peace was present in Europe. Europe was fixed, but it turned out different.
Right. But from somebody, speaking to you from the Balkan region, where there are quite a number of countries still aspiring to join NATO, would you say that NATO's success can be attributed solely to its military prowess, or are there significant economic, diplomatic, and ideological factors that contribute to its enduring prominence? And does joining the alliance improve a country's economy, trade relations, and standard of living?
So in general, in Europe, NATO has become the background guarantee that investments will be safe and secure. NATO offers security for the market, for investments and welfare policies and so forth. So in general, yes, NATO is part of the equation that allows European and North American states to be prosperous and well off. In the Balkans, you asked about the Balkans. In the Balkans, it has been a little bit different. NATO has had some means and has intervened in Bosnia-Herzegovina and Kosovo, as we know. But the Balkans are still very divided. 3 of the former Yugoslav states have made it into NATO, 3 have not. And NATO is still finding out how it can be in the Balkans for the long haul, working with the EU and the Council of Europe to offer a sense of stability. But the sense of security is not yet there in the Balkans. And so investments are not following. Prosperity is not following. But NATO doesn't have the recipe for how to give security to the Balkans, but it is trying, and it's been trying for 30 plus years.
Right, but if you look at the Baltic states, their transition from communism into the European Union and NATO was quite quick, quite smooth. And then compare them to the Balkan states. I mean, what did Balkan states get wrong? Why wasn't there a quicker transition into the EU and NATO?
Well, the Baltic states were not at conflict with one another, and they didn't have big internal rivalries that meant that NATO would import a lot of conflict. The Baltic countries were in agreement that they wanted a future in the West. And they knocked on NATO's door, and NATO opened that door. Bosnia-Herzegovina, Kosovo, Serbia, those 3 countries in the Balkans, they are not sure where they would like to go. Serbia says it would like to go into the EU, but not into NATO. There's still a lot of tension related to Kosovo. Bosnia-Herzegovina, it's not sure that the people of Bosnia-Herzegovina would like to remain as one state. So all this uncertainty prevents these countries from being serious candidates for NATO membership. NATO is not going to import these conflicts into its own ranks, and certainly not against the will of people. NATO considers its door open to nations that would like to join NATO. It's not the other way around.
Right, but see, quite a number of times I've been told that NATO will only accept states that are, functioning, established democracies. However, let's rewind back to the 1950s and 60s. NATO accepted Turkey when it was under a military tutelage. Same thing with Spain and Greece had just come out of military dictatorships when they joined NATO. So back then it was, I believe, a Cold War calculus and a fight to get these states, into the alliance before they fall under Soviet influence, right?
This is true. So NATO's policy has always been one of balancing, on the one hand, the ideals of democracy and liberty, and on the other, the reality of geopolitics. So sometimes NATO has had to make pragmatic compromises. And getting Greece and Turkey in 1952, just 3 years after the foundation of the alliance, was all about geopolitics, because those 2 countries, they controlled access to the Black Sea and the important Soviet fleet there. And for a while, NATO thought that these 2 countries, they can become part of another security organization for the Middle East. That didn't happen. They pulled them in. They knew they were compromising on values, but it was important, so they did it. The Balkan countries do not have this geopolitical importance, this level. And so it becomes more of a value game. But NATO has always managed this balance in the context of where these countries are. And again, Spain made it in as they were transitioning from dictatorship to democracy. NATO made the decision, the NATO allies made the decision that we will allow them in and we will support this process. But Spain was important for the depth of NATO. It also had geopolitical importance for NATO. So certainly, and NATO is an alliance of ideals, but it's also pragmatic about how to implement them given the context.
Right. Now let's move on to Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So to what extent has the crisis, the invasion of Ukraine, influenced member states' perspectives on collective security imperatives and the fulfillment of defense commitments within NATO? And you know, what specific policy actions has NATO initiated in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
So NATO has gone from viewing Russia as an unreliable partner and a nuisance to seeing Russia as an aggressor and a potential instigator of major war against NATO. For now, it's against Ukraine, but it could be against NATO. So NATO has gone from having a small tripwire of defense, which they called enhanced forward presence, close to the border against Russia or in Eastern Europe, to now, because they consider Russia an aggressor, to building up what they call old-fashioned forward defense. We have to stop Russia at the border because we don't want them in to do to us what they're doing to Ukraine. All of this is happening. All agree that this must happen. Where it becomes difficult is, how fast should it happen? Who should carry the heavy military burden? Why are European allies not able to deliver more conventional firepower at the eastern frontier, given their economies, given that they should be alarmed? Europeans are ramping up, but they're not doing enough. And so they agree that the principle must be forward defense, but how to organize it, how to pay for it, that's a little bit of a headache.
Right. Could you explain to our, when you talk about, Russia and the threat it poses to NATO states, especially when it comes to the Baltics and Poland, we very often hear military analysts talking about the Suwalki corridor. Could you explain to our viewers the strategic importance of this corridor and how might, a potential scenario of Russia attempting to cut off this corridor look like in real life?
So the Suwalki corridor is between the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad, which lies on the Baltic Sea coast between Poland and Lithuania. And there's a short piece of NATO territory between Kaliningrad and Belarusia, which of course is an independent state, but very much under the wings of Russia. So between Belarusia and Kaliningrad, this is where Russian forces, either by firepower or by conventional maneuver, could close off the reinforcement of the Baltic states by land, which from a NATO perspective would happen to go through Poland, through the corridor, into Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Now, if that reinforcement over land cannot take place, it has to come by sea, through the Baltic Sea. And again, this can be prevented. Does NATO have enough ships and planes to do this? And if NATO cannot reinforce the Baltic countries, they cannot defend them. And that is very bad for NATO's credibility. It has to be seen as capable of defending all its allies. And that was always an issue. If Russia becomes belligerent, what do we do with the Suwalki Gap? Because of the Ukraine crisis, or the war in Ukraine, Russia's war on Ukraine, Finland and Sweden have now joined NATO. That helps a lot because they are access points to the Baltic area and to the 3 Baltic countries. So the Suwalki Gap remains important, but has become less dramatic given that Sweden and Finland are there as reinforcement points.
Right. I was wondering, when you listen to, as the U.S. election campaign is in full swing, when you hear former president and presidential candidate Donald Trump say that, the NATO should not intervene to defend a country which does not allocate the required 2% of its GDP on defense, how does that make you feel as somebody who has been studying the alliance?
Well, obviously, this is a statement that runs counter to all official NATO language that has been consistently employed by NATO leaders since 1949. You never question Article 5, the Musketeer Clause, whereby all allies agree to protect an individual ally. You never shake that commitment. You never question the credibility of the treaty. What Donald Trump has done, and he's done that for a number of years, is that he has made the commitment to collective defense contingent on how much money nations pay into their defense budgets.
Right.
And this is potentially very destructive.
Right, but you know, in a case of, let's imagine a worst case scenario. If a president of a country such as the United States decides that he will not give the green light for NATO. I mean, in this case, if a NATO member state is attacked by a belligerent force, who calls the shots? The NATO chief of staffs or the Supreme Allied Commander?
Well, first of all, if a NATO ally is attacked, that is an Article 5 situation. You don't need to have the governments come together and debate, is this an Article 5 situation? The interpretation, the legal interpretation of the treaty is that if you are attacked, it's an Article 5 situation. But then in the treaty, it's also up to the individual allies to determine how much are they going to give in aid of the country in concern. NATO's Supreme Allied Commander has at his disposal regional plans and commands, but the troops are national. And so he does need the backing of the governments to activate collective defense. And so it becomes, if you will, a collaboration between the governments saying, yes, we will defend the country in question, and we'll offer these troops, and then secure he has the plans, he has the commands, he has everything in place to actually go and defend the country.
Wait, so does the approval come from, in this case, Donald Trump, or from the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff?
Donald Trump.
All right. Professor, it was a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much once again for your time.
Well, thank you. It was a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.